The distress signal reached Earth on a Tuesday morning, cutting through the routine chatter of interstellar communication networks like a scream in a library. Admiral Sarah Chun was reviewing fleet deployment reports when her aide, Lieutenant Morrison, burst into her office without knocking. "Admiral, you need to see this immediately," Morrison said, his face pale as he thrust a data pad toward her. Chun took the device and frowned at the readings. The signal was coming from the Kepler 442 system, nearly 1,200 light-years away. What made her blood run cold wasn't the distance, but the source. The Zilani Republic had been one of humanity's first peaceful contacts when Earth joined the Galactic Council 15 years ago. They were a gentle, herbivorous species known for their advanced medical technology and philosophical nature. The message began to play, and Chin's heart sank as she watched the holographic projection of Ambassador Kethvar, the Zilani representative she'd met during the Treaty of New Geneva. His usually pristine blue-silver fur was matted with what looked like blood, and his large, expressive eyes were filled with terror. To any who received this message, Kethvar's voice trembled through the universal translator. The Zilani Republic formally requests immediate assistance under Article 12 of the Galactic Protection Accords. "We are under siege by the hegemony of Vextal. Our worlds burn. Our people die. We have 3 days, perhaps less, before our last stronghold falls." The message cut to external footage, and Chun felt her jaw clench. Massive, angular warships hung in space above a world that had once been a paradise of crystalline cities and floating gardens. Now those cities were rubble, and the gardens were ash. Streams of smaller craft descended like vultures, and where they passed, nothing remained alive. How long ago was this transmitted? Chen asked, though she already suspected the answer wouldn't be good. "The timestamp shows it was sent 8 days ago," Morrison replied. "It's been bouncing through relay stations across the galaxy. By the time it reached us through normal diplomatic channels, they're probably already dead," Chen finished grimly. She stood and walked to the massive window overlooking Earth's orbital defense platforms. Below, the blue marble that had birthed humanity spun peacefully, unaware that somewhere in the cosmic dark, an entire civilization was being systematically exterminated. The Galactic Council had been formed 2 centuries ago after the last major interstellar war nearly wiped out half the known species in the galaxy. It was meant to prevent exactly this kind of aggression. Member species pledged mutual defense and agreed to resolve conflicts through diplomacy and mediation. The problem was that the hegemony of Vextal had never signed the accords. Chen had studied them extensively during her years at the Fleet Academy. The Vextal were apex predators from a world where evolution had favored ruthless efficiency over cooperation. Their society was built on conquest and subjugation. They viewed other species as either resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed. Most troubling of all, they had technology that rivaled or exceeded anything the Council possessed. "Give me President Harrison on secure channels," Chen ordered, "and prepare a briefing packet for the Joint Chiefs. If we're going to respond to this, we need to move fast." "Ma'am," Morrison hesitated. "The Zilani system is nearly 1,200 light-years away. Even our fastest ships would take weeks to reach them through hyperspace. If they only had 3 days..." "I know the math, Lieutenant," Chen said sharply. "But there's a principle at stake here. The Zilani asked for help. They trusted in the agreements we all signed. If we ignore this because it's inconvenient or dangerous, what does that say about humanity? What does that say about the promises we make?" Within 6 hours, President Harrison had convened an emergency session of Congress. The debate was fierce and immediate. Senator Williams from the Isolationist Party stood at the podium, his voice carrying across the chamber as he argued against military intervention. "My fellow representatives," Williams declared, "we must not allow emotion to cloud our judgment. The Zilani are 1,200 light-years away. By any reasonable calculation, they are already beyond our help. To commit our forces to what amounts to a revenge mission would be to risk human lives for no strategic gain. Congresswoman Martinez rose from her seat, her face flushed with anger. Senator Williams speaks of strategic gain while an entire species faces extinction. The Zilani shared their medical advances with us freely. Their bioregeneration technology has saved millions of human lives. Are we to stand by and watch as they are slaughtered simply because the distance makes rescue inconvenient? The argument continued for hours, but Chun had expected this. Humanity had always been divided when it came to foreign intervention. The difference was that this time, the decision would define not just their role in galactic politics, but their character as a species. The deciding factor came when Admiral Torres, the elderly head of Strategic Command, addressed the assembly. His weathered face bore the scars of the Martian rebellion 30 years ago, and when he spoke, even the most vocal opponents fell silent. "I fought in 3 wars during my career," Torres said quietly. Each time, politicians and analysts told us about acceptable losses and strategic calculations. But I want you to understand something about the enemy we're facing. The Vextal don't just conquer territory. They don't just subjugate populations. They commit genocide as a matter of policy. He activated a holographic display showing intelligence reports gathered by long-range scouts. These are images from the Threx system, conquered by the hegemony 18 months ago. The Threx were skilled engineers and mathematicians. Their cities could float among the clouds of gas giants. Look at what remains. The hologram showed dead worlds. Not just conquered, but sterilized. Every trace of Threx civilization had been systematically erased. Their floating cities had been dragged down into the crushing depths of gas giant atmospheres. Their colonies on airless moons had been reduced to radioactive craters. The Vextal don't take prisoners, Torres continued. They don't preserve conquered cultures for study or exploitation. They erase them completely, as if they never existed. If we allow this to happen to the Zilani, we become complicit in genocide. And if we become complicit once, where does it end? The vote was closer than Chun had hoped, but when the tally was announced, the resolution had passed by a margin of just 12 votes. Humanity would respond to the Zilani distress call. The next 72 hours became a blur of activity as Earth's military machine mobilized on a scale not seen since the colonial wars. Admiral Chun found herself appointed as fleet commander for what the media had already dubbed Operation Distant Thunder. The logistics were staggering. The United Earth Fleet's fastest ships could maintain hyperspace velocities of approximately 800 times light speed for extended periods. At maximum safe acceleration, they could reach the Zilani system in 18 days. But maximum safe acceleration assumed normal supply lines and support infrastructure. Chun stood in the primary briefing room of the UEF Retribution, flagship of the Earth Defense Force, as her staff laid out the operational parameters. Captain Rodriguez, her chief of operations, highlighted the main challenges on the tactical display. "Admiral, we're looking at a fleet deployment of unprecedented scope," Rodriguez reported. 347 vessels, including 12 dreadnoughts and 48 heavy cruisers. The supply train alone requires 86 cargo ships. "What about intelligence on enemy strength?" Chun asked, studying the data streams flowing across the display. Commander Park, head of intelligence, stepped forward. "Our long-range scouts report a Vextal fleet of approximately 500 ships in the Zilani system. However, intelligence suggests these are primarily occupation forces. Their main battle fleet is believed to be stationed at their forward base in the Zirian cluster." "Believed to be?" Chun raised an eyebrow. "The Vextal are extremely security conscious," Park admitted. "Our intelligence comes primarily from intercepted communications and long-range sensor sweeps. We know they've established a major staging area in the Zirian cluster, but we don't know the exact composition or strength of forces stationed there." Chun nodded grimly. Going into battle without solid intelligence was never ideal, but they were operating under constraints that made traditional reconnaissance impossible. By the time scout ships could reach the target system, conduct proper surveillance, and return with detailed reports, any survivors of the Zalani massacre would be long dead. Admiral, Lieutenant Morrison approached with another data pad. Long-range communications has received a response from the Galactic Council. Chun took the device and read the message with growing disgust. The Council's response was a masterpiece of diplomatic language that managed to express sympathy, concern, and regret while committing to absolutely nothing. They condemned the Vextal aggression in the strongest possible terms and called for an immediate ceasefire. They also noted that the Zalani system lay outside the established borders of Council space, and therefore fell into a legal gray area regarding mutual defense obligations. Cowards, Chin muttered under her breath. She'd expected as much, but it still left a bitter taste in her mouth. The Council was dominated by species that had evolved as prey animals or lived in comfortable isolation for millennia. They were constitutionally incapable of the kind of rapid, decisive action that the current crisis demanded. Ma'am, Rodriguez cleared his throat. There's one more factor we need to discuss. The Vextal are known to employ scorched earth tactics when facing potential retaliation. Intelligence suggests that if they detect our fleet approaching, they may accelerate their extermination protocols. Meaning they might kill any remaining Zalani survivors rather than allow them to be rescued. Chen closed her eyes and tried to push down the rage building in her chest. Every decision in this operation came with impossible choices and unacceptable risks. But that's what command meant. That's what leadership demanded. We proceed as planned, she said finally. But we modify our approach vector. Instead of a direct assault on the Zalani system, we'll strike the Zirian cluster first. The room fell silent as her staff absorbed the implications of this decision. Commander Park was the first to speak. Admiral, that would mean engaging their main battle fleet with unknown strength and capabilities. Our primary mission is to rescue Zalani survivors. Our primary mission, Chun corrected, is to stop a genocide. If the Vextal main fleet is intact, they'll simply move on to the next target after they finish with the Zalani. The Council won't act. The other spacefaring species are too terrified or too distant to intervene. That leaves us. She turned to face her assembled officers, seeing her own grim determination reflected in their faces. We're not just going to rescue the Zalani, she announced. We're going to send a message to the Vextal and every other predator species in the galaxy. Humanity will not tolerate genocide. We will not stand by while innocent civilizations are erased from existence. And we will make the cost of such actions so high that no one will dare attempt them again. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward. Admiral, are you talking about total war? Chun looked at the tactical display showing the positions of human and Vextal forces across dozens of star systems. She thought about the Zalani ambassador's terrified face, about entire worlds reduced to ash, about civilizations wiped from existence as if they had never been. The Vextal have been conducting total war against peaceful species for decades, she said quietly. They just didn't realize that someone might eventually fight back using the same rules they've been playing by. It's time they learned what happens when they pick a fight with a species that evolved as persistence hunters. The fleet departed Earth's orbital shipyards 48 hours later, the largest military force humanity had ever assembled. As the Retribution engaged its hyperdrive and slipped into the twisted space-time of hyperspace travel, Chin stood on the bridge watching the stars blur into abstract patterns of light. Somewhere ahead of them, the Vextal were continuing their systematic destruction of Zalani civilization, confident in their superiority and convinced of their invincibility. They were about to discover that humanity had a very different perspective on acceptable losses and strategic calculations. The war that was coming would not be fought according to the civilized rules of engagement that govern council conflicts. It would be fought according to the brutal logic that the Vextal themselves had established. And when it was over, the galaxy would remember that some species should never be allowed to mistake kindness for weakness. The Zirian cluster hung in space like a malevolent jewel, its three binary star systems casting harsh light across the asteroid fields that the Vextal had converted into massive industrial complexes. Admiral Chun stood in the observation deck of the UEF Retribution, watching as her fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation. 347 human warships materialized simultaneously, their arrival creating gravitational ripples that would be detected by Vextal sensors within minutes. Fleet deployment complete, reported Captain Rodriguez from the bridge. All ships reporting ready status. Long-range sensors are detecting significant enemy presence throughout the cluster. Chun activated her neural link to the fleet's tactical network, allowing her to see through the sensors of every ship under her command simultaneously. The scope of the Vextal operation became immediately clear. They hadn't just built a forward base in the Zirian cluster. They had constructed an entire war machine. Massive orbital foundries stripped asteroids for raw materials, feeding assembly lines that churn out weapons and ship components. Mining operations scarred every significant body in the system, their automated extractors working around the clock to fuel the hegemony's expansion. Most disturbing of all were the prison complexes built into the hollowed-out cores of several large asteroids. Admiral, Commander Park's voice carried note of barely controlled rage through the communications channel. I'm reading life signs from those prison facilities. Multiple species, including what appeared to be Zilani biosignatures. Chun felt her jaw clench. The Vextal weren't just exterminating conquered populations. They were keeping some alive for forced labor. The moral calculus of the situation had just become even more complex. Any assault on the cluster risked killing the very people they had come to save. Enemy fleet composition, she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. 638 vessels, reported Lieutenant Commander Yates from the sensor station, including 24 of their heavy battleships, and what appears to be a command dreadnought roughly twice the mass of our largest ships. The numbers weren't encouraging. The human fleet was outnumbered nearly 2-1, and they were operating at the extreme edge of their supply lines while the Vextal were fighting in their own territory. Conventional tactical doctrine would call for withdrawal and regrouping with reinforcements. But conventional doctrine assumed they had time for such luxuries. Admiral Chun, a new voice cut through the communications channel. This is Supreme Commander Krextar of the Hegemony Vextal. You will withdraw your fleet immediately or face total destruction. The holographic display activated, showing the image of the Vextal commander. Krextar stood nearly 3 meters tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming with bioluminescent patterns that indicated high rank within their warrior caste. His 6 limbs ended in razor-sharp claws that could tear through steel, and his compound eyes reflected a cold intelligence that Chun found deeply unsettling. I am authorized to offer you terms, Krextar continued, his voice carrying the artificial harmonics that the Vextal used to establish dominance. Withdraw now, and your species will be permitted to exist as a protectorate of the hegemony. Your worlds will be preserved, your population reduced to sustainable levels, and your technology appropriated for the greater glory of the Empire. Chun stepped forward, allowing her own image to be transmitted to the enemy flagship. She had shed her dress uniform in favor of combat armor, its matte black surface reflecting the harsh light of the cluster stars. Supreme Commander Krextar, she replied, I am Admiral Sarah Chun of the United Earth Fleet. I'm here to inform you that the systematic extermination of sentient species ends today. You will surrender all prisoners, withdraw your forces from conquered territories, and submit to judgment for crimes against sapient life. Krextar's mandibles clicked in what Chun recognized as Vextal laughter. You are seriously outnumbered, Admiral Chun. Your primitive vessels cannot match the technological superiority of the hegemony. I offer you one final opportunity to preserve your species. You misunderstand the situation, Chun replied coldly. This isn't a negotiation. This is a war crimes tribunal, and you're the defendant. The only question is whether you surrender now, or we take you by force. The communications channel went silent for several long seconds. When Krextar spoke again, his voice carried a note of genuine puzzlement. "Your species fascinates me, Admiral. You have traveled 1,200 light years to rescue aliens you barely know, knowing you face overwhelming odds. Such behavior defies rational explanation. Are all humans afflicted with this form of tactical insanity?" Chen smiled grimly. "It's not insanity, Commander. It's called having a conscience. Something your species apparently never evolved. Conscience is a luxury that evolution eliminates in any species with the potential for true power," Krextar replied. "You will learn this lesson shortly. All ships eliminate the human fleet." The Vextal formation immediately began to advance, their ships moving in the flowing organic patterns that characterize their military doctrine. Chen had studied their tactics extensively, but seeing them employed on this scale was both beautiful and terrifying. The enemy fleet flowed through space like a school of predatory fish, each ship maintaining perfect coordination with its neighbors, while the overall formation adapted dynamically to changing conditions. "All ships implement Phoenix Protocol," Chun ordered through the fleet network. Phoenix Protocol was humanity's answer to the Vextal tactical doctrine, developed through analysis of their previous engagements with Council forces, where the enemy relied on organic coordination and overwhelming numbers. Humans would employ precision strikes and technological superiority. It was a strategy that played to humanity's strengths as a species that had evolved to hunt megafauna through persistence and coordination. The human fleet split into 12 smaller formations, each consisting of 25 to 30 ships. These groups began moving through the asteroid field in seemingly random patterns, using the complex gravitational fields and debris clouds to mask their sensor signatures. To an outside observer, it might have looked like panic, but Chen knew better. "First contact in 30 seconds, reported Captain Rodriguez. Long-range missiles away." The opening exchange revealed the technological gap between the two fleets immediately. Human missile systems were more accurate and carried more sophisticated electronic countermeasures, but Vextal point defense systems were faster and more efficient. The first wave of projectiles was intercepted at a rate of nearly 90%, while return fire from the enemy achieved only 60% effectiveness against human defensive systems. "Their shields are adapting faster than projected," reported Lieutenant Commander Yates. "They're using some kind of dynamic frequency modulation that's reducing our beam weapon effectiveness by 40%. Chen nodded grimly. She'd expected something like this. The Vextal had been fighting advanced civilizations for centuries, and their technology had evolved to counter most conventional weapon systems. But humanity hadn't become the dominant species on Earth by relying on conventional approaches. "Implement Pandora Directive," she ordered. The Pandora Directive was one of humanity's most closely guarded military secrets. It represented a fundamental shift in tactical thinking that had emerged from Earth's experience with asymmetric warfare. Instead of trying to match enemy capabilities directly, human forces would create cascading system failures that turned the enemy's own strengths against them. The asteroid fields of the Zirian cluster were honeycombed with mining tunnels and processing facilities, many of which contained volatile materials and unstable chemical compounds. Human ships began targeting these facilities not with direct weapons fire, but with precisely calibrated gravitational pulses that destabilized the delicate equilibrium, maintaining structural integrity. The effect was spectacular and devastating. As mining facilities collapsed and processing plants exploded, the resulting debris created a chaotic environment that disrupted Vextal sensors and communications. The organic coordination that made their fleet so effective began to break down as individual ship commanders lost contact with the central command structure. Enemy formation integrity dropping to 60%, Yates reported. They're having trouble maintaining tactical coordination in the debris field. Chen watched the tactical display as her plan unfolded. The Vextal had built their industrial complex to maximize efficiency and resource extraction. They had never considered that an enemy might turn their own infrastructure against them. It was a blind spot that revealed something fundamental about their psychology. They saw war as a contest between fleets, not as a competition between entire civilizations. Admiral, Commander Park's voice carried urgent concern. I'm detecting energy buildups in the prison facilities. The Vextal are implementing termination protocols for all captives. Chun felt her blood turn to ice. This was the scenario she had dreaded most. The enemy was preparing to execute their prisoners rather than allow them to be rescued. She had perhaps minutes before thousands of innocent beings were murdered out of spite. All ships, emergency redeployment, she ordered. Priority Alpha targets are now the prison facilities. Everything else is secondary. The human fleet abandoned their complex tactical maneuvering and drove straight through the asteroid field toward the prison complexes. It was a desperate gambit that exposed them to concentrated enemy fire, but Chin had no choice. She would not allow the Vextal to massacre their captives. The fighting became brutal and close quarters as human ships closed to point-blank range with the prison facilities. Vextal defenders poured fire into the advancing formation, but human crews pressed forward with a determination that seemed to confuse and unnerve the enemy. Several ships took catastrophic damage, but continued their attack runs, their crews fighting to the last breath to complete their mission. The heavy cruiser UEF Vengeance took a direct hit from a Vextal plasma cannon that penetrated her main armor belt and detonated inside the engineering section. Captain Morrison, Admiral Chen's former aide, refused orders to abandon ship and instead rammed the damaged vessel directly into the primary prison facility's defensive grid. Facility 1 secured, reported the Marine commander leading the boarding operation. We've got approximately 3,000 prisoners from 7 different species. Medical teams are standing by for mass casualty evacuation. Similar reports began flooding in from other assault teams. The prison facilities yielded a horrifying glimpse into Vextal methods. Prisoners have been sorted by species and subjected to various forms of medical experimentation. Some are being used to test biological weapons, others to evaluate the effectiveness of psychological torture techniques. The Vextal weren't just committing genocide, they were treating it as a scientific research project. Admiral, Captain Rodriguez's voice carried a note of concern. The enemy command ship is moving to intercept. They're bringing their main battle line with them. Admiral, Commander Park reported, I'm reading massive energy buildups throughout the enemy fleet. They're preparing to implement scorched earth protocols for the entire cluster. Chun understood immediately. The Vextal had decided that if they couldn't maintain control of the cluster, they would deny it to humanity by destroying everything of value. This included not just the industrial facilities, but also the remaining prison complexes and their thousands of captives. All ships, Chun announced across the fleet network. This is Admiral Chun. The enemy is preparing to destroy this entire facility rather than allow us to liberate their prisoners. I'm implementing final protocol. All personnel not essential to combat operations are to evacuate immediately to designated ships. Those remaining will stay to complete the mission. Final protocol was humanity's ultimate military doctrine, developed from the species' long history of warfare against impossible odds. When faced with annihilation, human forces would inflict maximum damage on the enemy regardless of the cost to themselves. It was a strategy that had served them well throughout their evolutionary history, from the first humans who drove cave bears from their territory to the soldiers who held impossible positions against overwhelming odds. The human fleet reformed into a single massive spearhead aimed directly at Krekstar's command ship. Instead of trying to preserve their forces for future operations, every captain committed everything they had to one final, desperate assault. Ships that had expended their missiles continued the attack with beam weapons. Vessels that lost their main guns used point defense systems. Ships that lost all weapons rammed enemy vessels with whatever power remained in their engines. The space around the Zirian cluster became a hellscape of debris and energy discharge as two civilizations met in total warfare. But As the battle reached its climax, something unexpected began to happen. The organic coordination that had made the Vextal fleet so formidable was breaking down not because of technical failures, but because of psychological ones. Individual Vextal commanders began making decisions based on self-preservation rather than tactical necessity. Ships that should have maintained formation broke away to avoid suicidal human attack runs. The elegant flowing patterns of their advance devolved into a chaotic scramble as each vessel tried to avoid the seemingly endless waves of humans willing to die to complete their mission. Supreme Commander Krextar found himself facing a situation that his species had never encountered in their long history of conquest. They had always fought civilizations that valued survival above victory, species that would surrender when the cost became too high. They had never faced an enemy that measured success not by survival, but by the completion of the mission regardless of casualties. Admiral Chun, Krextar's voice carried a note of something that might have been respect. Your species has fought well, but this is madness. You cannot save these prisoners by destroying yourselves. Chun, standing on the bridge of her battered flagship as damage reports poured in from throughout the ship, looked at the tactical display showing the positions of both fleets. The human force was virtually destroyed, with only a handful of ships still capable of independent operation. But the Vextal fleet was also heavily damaged, and, more importantly, the fight was visibly collapsing. Commander Krextar, she replied, you still don't understand. This isn't about saving these particular prisoners. This is about establishing a principle. Every species in the galaxy is watching this battle. They're learning that genocide carries a price, that there are consequences for erasing civilizations from existence. She paused, watching as another human ship exploded under enemy fire while successfully destroying a Vextal battleship in return. You want to know if all humans are afflicted with tactical insanity? Chun continued. The answer is yes. We're insane enough to travel 1,200 light years to save people we've never met. We're insane enough to fight impossible odds rather than accept injustice. And we're insane enough to make you pay such a high price for your conquest that you'll think twice before attempting another genocide. The final phase of the battle lasted less than 20 minutes, but its consequences would echo across the galaxy for generations. When the shooting finally stopped, the Zirian cluster lay in ruins, its industrial capacity destroyed, and its strategic value eliminated. The Vextal fleet had been reduced to less than 40% of its original strength, while the human force had been almost completely annihilated. But in the cargo holds of the few surviving human ships, nearly 8,000 prisoners from dozens of species were finally free. The remnants of Admiral Chen's fleet limped through hyperspace toward the Zalani homeworld, their hulls scarred and their crews running on determination and stimulants. The UEF Retribution had lost 2 of her main engines and most of her port armor plating, but she still led the formation of 23 surviving ships that represented all that remained of humanity's greatest military expedition. In the medical bays of those ships, over 8,000 liberated prisoners from dozens of species received treatment that ranged from emergency surgery to psychological counseling. The horrors they had endured in Vextal captivity would take years to fully understand, but preliminary reports painted a picture that made even hardened military personnel struggle to maintain their composure. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the fleet's chief medical officer, entered Admiral Chen's quarters carrying a data pad and an expression that looked like she hadn't slept in days. Chen was standing at the single remaining viewport in her cabin, watching the twisted patterns of hyperspace flow past as they approached what they all hoped would be their final destination. Admiral, Dr. Vasquez said quietly, I have the preliminary medical reports on the rescued prisoners. Chun turned from the window, noting the way the doctor's hands shook slightly as she held the datapad. How bad is it? Worse than we imagined, Vasquez replied. The Vextal weren't just using them for forced labor. They were conducting systematic biological experiments, testing the limits of pain tolerance across different species. evaluating the effectiveness of various psychological breaking techniques. Some of the prisoners have been in captivity for over 3 years. Chun took the datapad and scanned the medical summaries, feeling her anger build with each line she read. The Vextal had treated sentient beings like laboratory animals, conducting experiments that served no purpose beyond satisfying their curiosity about the nature of suffering. "There's something else," Dr. Vasquez continued. "I've been interviewing some of the more coherent prisoners. According to them, the Zirian cluster was just one of several such facilities. The Vextal have similar installations throughout their territory, each one containing thousands of prisoners from conquered civilizations." The implications hit Chun like a physical blow. If the doctor was correct, then the prisoners they had rescued represented only a tiny fraction of the Vextal's total captive population. Somewhere in the darkness between the stars, hundreds of thousands of beings were enduring the same horrors they had just witnessed. "Admiral," Lieutenant Morrison's voice came through the communications system. "We're receiving a priority transmission from Earth. President Harrison wants to speak with you immediately." Chun made her way to the bridge, noting how her surviving crew members moved with the careful deliberation of people pushed beyond their normal limits. The space was cramped and dimly lit, with several key stations replaced by emergency equipment after battle damage had destroyed the primary systems. President Harrison's image appeared on the main display, his face grave as he took in the visible damage to the flagship's bridge. Behind him, Chun could see other figures that she recognized as members of the cabinet and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "Admiral Chun," Harrison began, "first, let me say that the entire nation is proud of what you and your crews have accomplished. The rescue of those prisoners has captured the world's imagination and demonstrated humanity's commitment to justice among the stars." Chun waited for the inevitable, but that she could hear coming in the president's tone. "However," Harrison continued, "we've been monitoring long-range communications traffic throughout the galaxy, and the situation has become extremely complicated. The Galactic Council has condemned your attack on the Zirian cluster as an act of unilateral aggression. They're demanding that you return immediately to face a tribunal for violating interstellar law." "What about the genocide the Vextal were committing?" Chun asked, struggling to keep her voice level. "What about the thousands of prisoners we rescued?" "The Council acknowledges that the Vextal actions were regrettable," Harrison replied with obvious distaste. "But they maintain that your response was disproportionate and conducted without proper authorization from the galactic community." Chun felt a bitter laugh escape her lips. "Disproportionate? We lost over 90% of our fleet saving people from torture and experimentation, and they consider our response disproportionate." Secretary of Defense Williams stepped into view beside the president. "Admiral, there are also strategic concerns we need to discuss. Intelligence reports indicate that the Vextal are mobilizing their main battle fleets in response to your attack. They're calling it an act of war against the hegemony and demanding immediate retaliation against Earth." "Let them come," Chun replied without hesitation. "We've seen what they do to defenseless civilizations. At least humanity can fight back." "Admiral," President Harrison's voice carried a note of concern, "you need to understand the scale of what we're facing. The Vextal hegemony encompasses over 200 star systems. Their total military strength is estimated at over 10,000 ships of the line. Earth's entire defensive fleet numbers less than 800 vessels." Chun looked around her damaged bridge, at the crew members who had followed her across 1,200 light years to save people they had never met. She thought about the prisoners in their medical bays, beings who had suffered unimaginable torment because no one had been willing to stand up to the Vextal war machine. "Mr. President," she said finally, "I understand the mathematical realities of our situation, but I also understand something else. The Vextal have built their entire empire on the assumption that other species will always choose survival over principles. That when faced with impossible odds, civilizations will surrender rather than fight." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "They've never encountered a species that values justice more than safety. They've never faced an enemy that would rather die fighting than live as slaves. That gives us an advantage that can't be measured in ship counts or weapon specifications." Harrison frowned. "Admiral, I need you to be absolutely clear about what you're proposing." "I'm not proposing anything, sir," Chen replied. "I'm stating a fact. The war has already begun. The Vextal started it when they decided to commit genocide against peaceful species. We're simply choosing to fight it on our terms instead of waiting for them to come to us." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent alarm from the sensor station. Lieutenant Commander Yates looked up from his console with an expression of disbelief. "Admiral, we're detecting massive hyperspace signatures ahead of us. Multiple fleets are converging on the Zolani system." Chun moved to the sensor display and studied the readings. What she saw defied her expectations and challenged everything she thought she knew about galactic politics. "Those aren't all Vextal signatures," Yates reported. "I'm reading ship configurations from at least a dozen different species. Some of them are council members." The tactical display updated as more data became available, revealing a complex situation developing around the Zolani homeworld. A large Vextal fleet was indeed present, apparently preparing to complete their extermination of the surviving Zolani population. But they were facing something unprecedented in recent galactic history, a multi-species coalition that had assembled to oppose them. "I'm reading ships from the Altarian Republic, the Centauri Federation, even some of the neutral worlds," Yates continued, his voice filled with wonder. "It looks like half the galaxy has decided to get involved." Chun felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. If other species were finally willing to stand up to Vextal aggression, it could change the entire balance of power in the galaxy. But it could also turn what had been a relatively contained conflict into a full-scale interstellar war. "Admiral Chen," President Harrison's voice carried new urgency through the communication channel. "Are you seeing what we're seeing here?" "Yes, sir," Chen replied. "It appears that our actions at the Zirian cluster have had consequences beyond what anyone anticipated." Dr. Vasquez, who had been monitoring the medical networks, looked up from her station with an expression of amazement. "Admiral, I'm receiving communications from the Coalition fleet. They want to coordinate medical support for the rescued prisoners. Apparently, news of what we found in those facilities has been transmitted throughout the galaxy." Chen began to understand what was happening. The galaxy had watched humanity travel 1,200 light-years to rescue strangers from genocide. They had seen human crews sacrifice themselves to save people they had never met. And when the full horror of Vextal methods had been revealed, other species had finally found the courage to act on their own conscience. Lieutenant Morrison, Chun ordered, "Open communications channels to the Coalition fleet. I want to speak with their commanders." The main display activated, showing a remarkable sight. The screen split into multiple sections, each showing the bridge of a different alien warship. Chen found herself looking at representatives of species that had never cooperated on this scale in recorded history. Commander Veltar of the Altarian Republic spoke first, his crystalline features shimmering with the bioluminescent patterns that indicated deep emotion among his species. "Admiral Chun," Veltar said, "the Altarian Republic formally requests permission to join your mission. Your actions at the Zirian cluster have reminded us that some principles are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost." Similar declarations came from the other coalition members. The Centauri Federation, the Rigel Cooperative, even the isolationist vegan empire had sent ships to support what they were calling the human doctrine, the principle that genocide would be met with immediate and overwhelming retaliation, regardless of the distance or difficulty involved. Captain Thexera of the Rigelian Defense Force, a species known for their mathematical precision and emotional restraint, surprised everyone by speaking with obvious passion. "Admiral, our species has watched the Vextal commit atrocities for decades, while we calculated the costs of intervention. Your people have shown us that some calculations include factors that cannot be quantified." Chun felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness as she listened to the coalition commanders. Humanity's sacrifice had accomplished something that centuries of diplomacy had failed to achieve. It had given other species permission to act on their conscience instead of their fear. Commanders, Chen replied, I want to be absolutely clear about what we're facing. The Vextal don't fight according to the civilized rules of engagement that govern most galactic conflicts. They commit genocide as a matter of policy. They torture prisoners for entertainment. They erase entire civilizations from existence because they enjoy the act of destruction. She paused, looking at the alien faces on her screen. If we do this together, we're not just fighting a war. We're choosing what kind of galaxy we want to live in. We're deciding whether justice or fear will govern the relationships between species. Admiral Tkaith of the Centauri Federation, whose people were known throughout the galaxy for their philosophical nature, spoke with quiet intensity. Admiral Chun, my people have a saying, the measure of a civilization is not its technology or its territory, but its willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Your species has reminded us of our own principles. The Coalition fleet began coordinating their approach to the Zilani system, with each species contributing their unique capabilities to the overall effort. The Altarians provided advanced sensor technology that could detect Vextal cloaked ships. The Rigelians contributed their expertise in defensive systems and point defense networks. The Centaurians brought their knowledge of Vextal psychology and tactical doctrine. But as they approached the Zilani homeworld, long-range sensors revealed the full scope of what they would be facing. The Vextal had not just brought their occupation fleet to finish destroying the Zilani. They had summoned their Grand Armada, the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. Admiral, Lieutenant Commander Yates reported with barely controlled alarm. I'm reading over 1,500 Vextal ships in the system, including their super dreadnoughts and what appears to be their mobile command citadel. Chun stared at the tactical display, understanding immediately that this battle would determine the future of galactic civilization. The Vextal had committed their ultimate forces to this engagement, betting everything on their ability to crush the Coalition and establish their dominance once and for all. All ships, she announced across the Coalition network, this is Admiral Chun. In approximately 6 hours, we will drop out of hyperspace into the most important battle in galactic history. The Vextal have gathered their Grand Armada to make an example of us. They want to demonstrate that resistance is futile and genocide is inevitable. She looked around her bridge at the crew members who had already given everything they had for this cause. They're about to learn that some species would rather burn down the galaxy than allow evil to triumph. They're about to discover what happens when people who value justice more than survival decide to make a stand. The Coalition fleet dropped out of hyperspace 18 hours later, emerging into a system that had already been transformed into a graveyard. The beautiful world that had once been the crown jewel of Zilani civilization was now a blackened husk, its oceans boiled away and its continents reduced to radioactive wastelands. But in the space around that dead world, the largest battle in galactic history was about to begin. And for the first time in their long history of conquest, the Vextal were about to face enemies who valued principles more than survival. The Zilani homeworld hung before them like a monument to systematic destruction, its once blue oceans now pools of molten glass reflecting the harsh light of dying cities. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of the UEF Retribution, watching through the main viewport as the largest fleet in galactic history prepared for the most important battle ever fought between civilized species. The Coalition had assembled nearly 800 ships from 17 different species, each vessel representing their civilization's commitment to the principle that genocide could not be tolerated. But arrayed against them was the Grand Armada of the Vextal hegemony, over 1,500 ships, including massive super dreadnoughts that dwarfed anything the Coalition possessed. Admiral, Lieutenant Commander Yates reported from the sensor station, I'm detecting energy signatures from the planet's surface. There are still Zilani survivors down there. Shin felt her heart skip a beat. Intelligence reports had suggested that the homeworld population had been completely exterminated, but Apparently, some had found ways to survive even the systematic destruction of their biosphere. The tactical situation had just become exponentially more complicated. How many? She asked, though she suspected the answer would break her heart. Approximately 50,000 life signs, Yates replied. They appear to be concentrated in underground facilities beneath the capital city. The Vextal are systematically destroying their shelter systems one by one. Admiral Tkaith of the Centauri Federation spoke through the Coalition communication network, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral certainty. Admiral Chun, we cannot allow those survivors to be murdered while we debate tactics. Whatever we're going to do, we must do it now. Chun looked at the tactical display, showing the positions of both fleets. The Vextal had arranged their forces in a perfect defensive formation around the planet, with their super dreadnoughts forming an impenetrable wall between the Coalition and the surface. Breaking through that formation would require sacrifices that might render any rescue attempt meaningless. Supreme Commander Krextar is transmitting, reported the communications officer. The holographic display activated, showing the Vextal leader standing on the bridge of his command citadel. Behind him, Chun could see the organic architecture that characterized Vextal ship design, all flowing curves and predatory angles that seemed to suggest movement even in stillness. Admiral Chun, Krextar began, his voice carrying new undertones that suggested genuine respect. You have surprised the hegemony. We did not expect your species to inspire such widespread resistance to our expansion. It has been educational. Chun stepped forward, allowing her image to be transmitted to the enemy fleet. Commander Krextar, this is your final opportunity to surrender. Release the Zilani survivors, withdraw your forces from all conquered territories, and submit to judgment for your crimes against sapient life. Krextar's mandibles clicked in what she had learned was Vextal amusement. Admiral, even you must understand the mathematical impossibility of what you're proposing. My Grand Armada represents the accumulated military might of 2 centuries of conquest. Your coalition, while impressive, cannot hope to match our firepower. You're still making the same mistake, Chun replied. You think this is about firepower. You think warfare is a contest between weapons and ships. But that's not what this is about. She paused, looking around her bridge at the crew members who had followed her across the galaxy to save people they had never met. This is about what kind of species we choose to be. It's about whether we'll stand by and watch genocide because it's convenient, or whether we'll fight for justice even when the odds are impossible. You've built your entire empire on the assumption that other species will always choose survival over principles. Today, you're going to learn how wrong you've been. The communication channel went silent for several long seconds. When Krextar spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been sadness. Admiral Chun, your species has shown courage that defies rational explanation. In other circumstances, I believe we could have learned much from each other. But the hegemony cannot allow your example to spread throughout the galaxy. Too many species would begin to resist if they believed resistance was possible. Chun understood immediately. This battle wasn't really about the Zilani survivors or even about the Coalition fleet. It was about an idea. The idea that genocide could be stopped. The idea that justice was worth any sacrifice. The idea that some principles were more important than survival. All Coalition ships, Chun announced across the fleet network. This is Admiral Chun. In approximately 10 minutes, we will commence the final assault on the Vextal Grand Armada. Every species represented in this fleet has chosen to be here. Every crew member has volunteered to risk everything for the sake of people they will probably never meet. She looked at the tactical display showing the impossible odds they faced. The Vextal expect us to calculate the costs and withdraw when we realize we cannot win. They expect us to prioritize our own survival over the lives of 50,000 Zilani civilians. They expect us to act like every other species they've encountered in 2 centuries of conquest. The fleet began moving into attack formation, 800 ships against 1,500, courage against calculation, justice against expediency. They're about to learn that some species would rather burn than bow. They're about to discover what happens when people who value principles more than safety decide to make their final stand. The battle began with a coordinated assault by the Coalition's longest-range weapon systems. Human missile salvos, Altarian plasma torpedoes, and Centauri gravitic mines struck the Vextal outer perimeter simultaneously, creating gaps in their formation that the smaller Coalition ships could exploit. But the Grand Armada's response was devastating. Super dreadnoughts that massed more than entire human battle groups poured fire into the attacking formation with weapons that could crack planets. The beautiful, flowing coordination that had made the Vextal military so effective was displayed on a scale that turned space itself into a killing field. Coalition losses are mounting rapidly, reported Captain Rodriguez from the tactical station. We've lost over 60 ships in the first 10 minutes. Chun watched the tactical display with a detached focus that came from accepting the inevitable. This wasn't a battle they could win through conventional tactics or superior strategy. The only way to reach the Zalani survivors was to pay a price in blood that would shock the galaxy into understanding what humanity and its allies were willing to sacrifice for justice. All ships, implement Thermopylae Protocol, Chun ordered. Thermopylae Protocol was the Coalition's adaptation of humanity's final protocol, modified to incorporate the unique capabilities of multiple species. Instead of trying to preserve forces for future operations, every ship would expend everything it had to inflict maximum damage on the enemy, accepting total destruction as the price of victory. The effect on the Vextal formation was immediate and dramatic. Ships that had expended their primary weapons continued the attack with secondaries. Vessels that lost all armament rammed enemy ships with whatever power remained in their engines. Crews that lost life support continued fighting in environmental suits until the last possible moment. Dr. Vasquez, coordinating medical evacuation efforts from the few ships designated as rescue vessels, reported what she was seeing with barely controlled emotion. Admiral, the rescued prisoners are asking to be transferred to combat vessels. They want to participate in the battle. Chun felt tears she didn't know she had been holding back begin to flow down her face. The beings they had rescued from Vextal torture camps wanted to risk their lives to save other victims of the same systematic cruelty. Permission granted, she replied without hesitation. Anyone who wants to fight for justice has earned the right to do so. The battle reached a crescendo of violence that strained the laws of physics as hundreds of ships poured energy into a volume of space barely larger than Earth's solar system. The gravitational distortions created by so many drives and weapons operating simultaneously began to affect the planet below, triggering massive seismic events that threatened the underground shelters where the Zalani survivors were hiding. Admiral, Lieutenant Commander Yates shouted over the sound of alarms. The planet's crust is destabilizing. The shelters have perhaps 20 minutes before complete geological collapse. Chun looked at the tactical display, showing their remaining forces. The Coalition had been reduced to less than 200 ships, but they had managed to punch through the outer layers of the Vextal defensive formation. The planet was within reach, but barely. All remaining ships, she announced. This is Admiral Chun. We have one chance to save those survivors. Everything we've sacrificed, everything our people have died for, comes down to the next 20 minutes. I want every ship that can still move to make a run for the planet. Ignore everything else. Save those people. The final phase of the battle became a desperate race against time as the surviving Coalition ships drove through the heart of the Vextal Grand Armada toward the dying planet below. Ships exploded under concentrated enemy fire, but their sacrifice created gaps that other vessels could exploit. The UEF Retribution, her hull breached in dozens of places and her crew reduced to a handful of survivors, led the final assault wave toward the planet's surface. Chin stood on her bridge as atmospheric entry systems that were never designed for combat conditions struggled to keep the ship intact during its descent. Landing sites located, reported the few remaining crew members working through smoke and emergency lighting. Zalani survivors are converging on extraction points. The evacuation became a nightmare of precision timing and desperate improvisation. Coalition ships landed in the ruins of once beautiful cities, while Vextal fighters strafed their landing zones. Marine teams from a dozen different species worked together to extract survivors from collapsing underground facilities while the planet literally fell apart around them. Dr. Vasquez coordinated the medical evacuation with the efficient brutality of someone who had seen too much suffering in too short a time. "We're loading them as fast as we can," she reported, "but the ships are taking heavy damage. We're going to lose some of the evacuation vessels before they can clear atmosphere." Chin watched through the bridge viewports as the last of the Coalition fleet fought to hold open an evacuation corridor while the planet died beneath them. The Zalani survivors being carried aboard were the sole remnants of a civilization that had existed for over 10,000 years. Everything their species had accomplished, every work of art or philosophy or science they had created, would live on only in the memories of these few thousand individuals. But they were alive. Against impossible odds, in defiance of mathematical probability, justice had prevailed over expediency. The galaxy would remember that genocide could be stopped, that principles could triumph over pragmatism, and that some species were willing to pay any price to protect the innocent. The final evacuation ship cleared atmosphere just as the Zalani homeworld's crust finally collapsed, turning the planet into a molten ball of rock and metal. Of the 800 ships that had entered the system, only 37 remained capable of independent operation. The Grand Armada had been reduced to fewer than 400 vessels, their perfect formations broken and their psychological dominance shattered. Supreme Commander Krekstar's voice came through the communication channel one final time, carrying something that Chun had never heard from a Vextal before: uncertainty. "Admiral Chun," Krekstar said quietly, "your species has accomplished something that we believed was impossible. You have made genocide more expensive than expansion. You have demonstrated that resistance is not futile, and that justice can triumph over power." Chun, standing in the ruins of her bridge with a handful of crew members who had survived the entire campaign, looked at the tactical display showing the scattered remnants of both fleets. "Commander Krekstar," she replied, "this is just the beginning. Every species in the galaxy has watched this battle. They've seen what happens when people decide that principles matter more than survival. Your empire is built on fear, but fear only works when people believe resistance is impossible." She paused, looking around at the survivors of the greatest military expedition in human history. "Today we proved that resistance is not only possible, but inevitable. The galaxy will never be the same. Other species will find the courage to stand up to tyranny because they've seen that it can be done. Your reign of terror is ending, one rescued prisoner at a time." The communication channel went silent, and the surviving Vextal ships began withdrawing from the system in the first organized retreat in their species' recorded history. The return journey to Earth took 3 months, as the surviving ships were forced to make frequent stops for repairs and medical treatment. The rescued Zalani survivors, nearly 57,000 individuals representing the sole remnants of their species, gradually began the psychological process of rebuilding their civilization from memory and hope. When the fleet finally reached Earth's orbital shipyards, they found a transformed world waiting for them. The battle at the Zalani homeworld had been transmitted throughout the galaxy in real time, and humanity's example had inspired widespread resistance to Vextal expansion. Over 40 species had formed the Galactic Defense Alliance, dedicated to the principle that genocide would be met with immediate and overwhelming retaliation. Admiral Chun stood on the observation deck of the orbital station where the Zalani survivors were being processed for permanent resettlement, watching as transport ships carried them to new homes on worlds throughout human space. Dr. Vasquez approached, carrying a final medical report and an expression of quiet satisfaction. "The last of the survivors have been cleared for release," she reported. "Physically, they're healthier than anyone had a right to expect after what they've endured. Psychologically, they're going to need years of support, but they're alive and they're free. Chen nodded, thinking about the price that had been paid for those words. 90% of the human fleet had been destroyed. Thousands of crew members from dozens of species had died in the battle. The galaxy would be dealing with the consequences of this conflict for generations. Admiral, Dr. Vasquez continued, I've been talking with some of the Zilani elders. They want to establish a memorial to the humans and aliens who died saving them. They're calling it the Monument of Conscience. Chen looked down at the planet below, where 8 billion humans are going about their daily lives, probably unaware that their species had just redefined the moral boundaries of galactic civilization. Doctor, she said finally, I think the real monument isn't going to be built from stone or metal. The real monument is going to be the galaxy that emerges from this conflict. A galaxy where genocide becomes impossible because too many species are willing to fight it. A galaxy where justice matters more than convenience. She paused, watching as another transport ship departed for the Centauri colonies, carrying Zilani survivors to their new homes. The Vextal made one fundamental error in their calculations, Chun continued. They assumed that all species would eventually choose survival over principles when the cost became high enough. They built their entire empire on that assumption. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her medical reports, and they forgot that some species evolved as persistence hunters, Chun replied with a slight smile. Species that would rather die chasing their prey than give up the hunt. Species that measure success not by survival, but by the completion of the mission. In the months that followed, the ripple effects of the Battle of Zilani would transform galactic politics in ways that none of the participants had fully anticipated. The Vextal hegemony, faced with organized resistance for the first time in their history, began fragmenting as individual worlds calculated the costs of continued aggression. The Galactic Council, shamed by humanity's example, finally found the courage to enforce their own principles. But perhaps most importantly, species throughout the galaxy learned that genocide was not inevitable, that resistance was not futile, and that justice could triumph over expediency when people were willing to pay the price. The galaxy would remember the humans who traveled 1,200 light-years to save strangers. It would remember the aliens who found courage in humanity's example. And it would remember that sometimes the most important battles are won not by superior tactics or overwhelming force, but by the simple refusal to let evil triumph over good. Admiral Sarah Chun retired from active service 6 months later, but her influence on galactic politics would continue for decades. The doctrine that bore her name became the foundation of interspecies law. Genocide would be met with immediate and overwhelming retaliation, regardless of distance or difficulty. The Zilani survivors eventually established a new homeworld in the Tau Ceti system, where they rebuilt their civilization with help from dozens of species that had been inspired by their rescue. The first building completed in their new capital city was indeed a monument, but not one built from stone or metal. It was a library containing the histories and cultures of every species that had participated in the coalition fleet. A reminder that justice is not a human concept, but a universal one shared by any species with the courage to act on their conscience when a moment demands it.